Our next speaker is Ari Offengenden, who's a professor of practice at Tulane University. He has written extensively on German Jewish culture, ideology, globalization, and culture and capitalism. He did his MA in cognitive psychology here at Tel Aviv University and a PhD in comparative literature at Haifa University. He did an habilitation at Tübingen University. He has taught at Monash University, Oberlin College, George Washington University, Tulane University, as well as has been a guest lecturer at Guangzhou University. In addition to numerous articles, Offengenden's book publications include The Ruling Ideas from 2023, Liberalization and Culture in Contemporary Israel from 2018, Introduction to the Poetry of Avraham Shlonsky, 2014, The Passion for Absence in Avraham Shlonsky, 2010. Offengenden was the editor of the Purdue University Press Humanities and Social Sciences Quarterly, CLC Web, Comparative Literature and Culture. He's the editor of monograph series of books in comparative culture studies at Purdue University Press, as well as elected member, European Academy of Sciences and Arts. His paper is titled Environmental Activism and Violence. Ari, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I was writing, when I was listening to these two fascinating talks, I was so enthralled. I was like writing questions, and then I was saying, who's next? Oh, me. I was quite surprised. Okay. I had so many questions. Most of my points people made already. I'd like maybe to offer a couple of points and open them to a discussion. And my interest in violence comes from two different kinds of sources. One is I tried to be an environmental activist for half a year in Extinction Rebellion. And at one point we had discussions about what shall we do? And Extinction Rebellion was very much for civil disobedience and never, and I suggested maybe we destroy some stuff. And they decided no, that's off limits. And I was wondering why like things like, for example, what Ende Gelände, or people like, for example, deflating air from SUVs. There is a whole discussion about that. Given that global warming, I feel that global warming is a bit like a Game of Thrones, where you have at the end these blue men. What are they called? White Walkers come to you from you're fighting all kinds of fights, and then suddenly White Walkers, people estimate refugees in the billions in 2050. Just a meager amount of refugees in Europe already turned half of Europe, not half, but maybe a third of Europe right wing. I don't know, like, given the amounts, what will happen, what kind of world we will have. I don't want to depress you, but given all that, there is a question in the environmental movement: what are the things that should be done? Okay. So that's one source. Another source is theory. And we heard today there is, if I went back to the 80s and became a deconstructionist, I would say that one topos of philosophers is always to make fun of kind of visual violence, spectral violence, like violence, and say, underneath this spectral violence, there is something deeper, there's structural violence, hidden violence. And we have this kind of narrative all along, and I totally get it, and I appreciate it. I'm not dissing it. Like, for example, when we read, let's say, Foucault on the prison. So at the beginning, we get treated to an execution, people are dismembered at the beginning of the book. But at the same time that he's giving us this fun of a dismemberment, horses are ripping limbs apart, a whole spectacle, he's kind of saying, yes, but this is just a spectacle. The sovereign is just impotent. That's why he's doing all of this spectacle of violence, because actually sovereignty was very inefficient. It couldn't reach even the border. The spectacle itself was sometimes went well, sometimes didn't go well. So you want to see real violence. Real violence is rationality, panopticon, modern criminology. That's real structural violence. And we have the same movement in Bourdieu with symbolic violence, and Zizek said something about structural violence versus what I call like direct or spectral violence, and others did as well, Marx. So if so many philosophers say one thing, maybe we should say the other. Sometimes I feel we should just switch it. And I want to say something in praise of physical violence, spectral violence, violence as theater. And why? So before I say some things regarding these types of violence and why sometimes they're useful, XR and a lot of activism today, even if you go to Tel Aviv, the activism against the regime change, the judicial reform, everyone seems to have read Erika Chenoweth, even Barak, Ehud Barak quoted her in Haaretz. She says if 3% of the population go down into the streets, then you have a regime change. And she wrote this very famous book, Why Civil Resistance Works. And supposedly, empirically, she proved that violence is not good. It doesn't work in changing regimes. It's not good for social change in any way. And so that has been, I would say, the coordinates in which all of us move in protests right now. Almost all of us move in these coordinates, in which our examples are Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and we're supposed to do civil resistance. And what's the argument for nonviolent civil resistance? The argument is that it's more inclusive, right? So the minute you use violence, you need it to be secretive. It has to be like a specific group. It's usually also exclusive. Old people, young people can't participate in, often don't want to participate in violent acts, destruction of property, etc. And the logic is that you use nonviolent civil resistance because it's more inclusive and you can get bigger numbers. It's not some moral argument. But it's, by activists, it's presented as a kind of pragmatic argument. Simply, if you want a movement to be inclusive enough, to have enough people, you need it to be nonviolent. Okay. What's wrong with these narratives? And I want to ask you, actually, at the end to discuss this. I don't have any certainties regarding, but historically, certainly, spectral violence has its uses. If you remember, for example, the suffragettes, they protested for the vote for 40, 50 years, I think, in England. Nothing moved in these 40, 50 years. At the end of the 19th century, they really did a concerted effort to get the vote by breaking and burning things. We often forget that the violence that the suffragists had used. Also, there is the theory of radical flank theory, which I think is very important. Radical flank theory. That means that in certain cases, you need a movement that has a more radical, threatening flank in order to win concessions for your moderate flank, right? So let's famous examples is without like Malcolm X, nobody would kind of give concessions to Martin Luther King, right? There was a threat of a more militant wing, and therefore concessions were given to the less militant wing, which became suddenly seen as a partner you can talk to, which before, of course, MLK was considered in America an abomination, right? Someone you can't even discuss things with, amazingly, right? So that's the radical flank theory. You have radical flank also in socialist struggles. We often forget this. We kind of have a narrative that whatever things that we got today were gotten by internal advocacy of the groups themselves. So let's say if we think about the work week, the six-day work week, or whatever rights that we have, pensions, we don't have them anymore. But let's say I'm talking to you in 1960, and we're in France or in Israel or whatever, not for Palestinians, but okay. You have certain rights. You got these rights. You might think that you got these rights because socialist movements advocated for these rights, and that would be correct. But no concessions would have been given to these socialist movements if there wasn't the threat of communism in the Eastern, in the Soviet Union. So these concessions were given to workers only because countries were afraid that they will turn communists. So if you think why France gave concessions, why Italy gave concessions to workers, it's only because they had large socialist parties, and they were afraid that the country itself will turn communist, because there was also another model that people can go to, and that's the Soviet Union, a violent model. So that's a radical flank theory. Without a radical flank, people can ignore the moderate flank, right? Let's see how we do with the protest against regime change, right? Not that it's I'm not very supportive of the status quo, obviously, but maybe moderate, non-violent protests can be just ignored without a threat of something more serious. I want to say also something about violence as a tool of radicalization. So oftentimes we who deal with the humanities, social sciences, we who read theory think that, people are radicalized. They read Marx, they read Foucault, whatever, they become radicalized and they become activists and they want to change the world. It's rarely the story that you hear with activists, including people like Lenin and others who read Marx or read whatever you need to read, Butler or whatever we read today. That's not the story. Lenin's brother was hanged, very visceral scene, by the Tsar. He witnessed it when he was 14 years old. And when I did research on environmental activists, they all have a story of, first of all, witnessing visceral violence against whales, against other species, against the environment. They have like a scene that they tell us a story of witnessing real violence. Not just structural abstractions. And oftentimes this story is also buttressed by then experiencing personal violence by policemen, security forces, etc., right? So for example, I saw this film about the Rote Armee Fraktion, Baader-Meinhof complex. It's a good film, you should see it. So they're aware that violence is going on against the Vietnamese. The Americans are bombing the Vietnamese, but they're really radicalizing when someone's shot in front of them, Rudi Dutschke, and some violence really visceral violence happens around them. That's when people become really committed politically. So that's my positive take on perhaps two things positive on violence. One of them is that it's threatening, it wins a lot of attention, and it makes for a radical wing, a radical flank for social movements that can be used, utilized. And the second is that violence often radicalizes, is the emotional fuel of activism, right? There was a lot of structural violence in America, 2 million people in jail, mass incarceration, no movement or very little movement, Angela Davis, etc. But people did not go into the streets, people wrote books, people did all kinds of things, but the spectral violence of a murder of a black man on the street being choked to death for 10 minutes made a difference. Now, structurally, you would say that's just one man. You know, you have 2 million people whose lives are ruined in America. Why do you care about one man? I would say one man and spectral violence is very important because that's the way humans work. Thank you.